Blackboard, under assignments, you should see a new project, Project 2, which is going to cover DynamoDB, Lambda, and API Gateway. I set it up so that it's really due, I try to target 3 weeks, but I know spring break is nested in there, so you have a little bit more time than 3 weeks, but spring break will be in there, so that'll hold things up. So if I go into the project, okay, so we're going to use that same data set that we have been using, so the games, players, teams in that baseball stats database. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to set up a DynamoDB database called baseball stats, and you're going to populate it with that seed data from those 3 files. Okay, fairly straightforward. And this has to be on AWS. So you're going to be running DynamoDB. This is not local. Okay, and the reason for that is because we're going to connect the Lambda service to this DynamoDB database. Okay, so then after you've created the database, I ask you to create 2 Lambda functions. So the first Lambda function is going to be an all-stats function that returns a collection of all the items from the table. So all the games, all the players, all the teams. So you'll do a scan saying I want all of the information from the baseball stats table. And that's going to be your return value, is that return value from that scan operation. So again, you're going to have to look back to that sample code that we created earlier in the semester about how do we connect our Lambda function to DynamoDB to grab that data. So the first one is just a scan. The second is going to require us to do a put where we're inserting a new record. And I'm asking you to handle the insert for a new team. Not a player, not a game, but for a new team. So you're going to create a new function called new team. It takes an incoming parameter in that event argument that looks like below. So I'm giving you some hard-coded data here, but really it's more for the format. So I didn't want to get into the particular saying, oh, the team ID is a string, the sort key is a string, and the team name's a string. You're going to be given those 3 pieces of information as a JSON object. That's what's going to come in as the event object. Okay? So 2 Lambda functions you're going to write for the project. And then most of the work is going to come in API Gateway. So API Gateway, we're going to create a REST API named Baseball Stats API. And then we're going to create a method get that's connected to the allstats Lambda function. So that'll be one of the endpoints. If I access the Baseball Stats API using an HTTP GET, then I'm going to be connected to the allstats. It's going to return all of my data. If I connect to the same API with a post, I want that connected to the new team Lambda function. So let's talk about that a little bit. When I post data, so it has to be via an HTTP post, and I'll show you how we can test this today. So I have to send this new team via an HTTP post to my Baseball Stats API endpoint. Otherwise, it's going to call the wrong function. So based on the HTTP verb, that's going to determine which function, which Lambda function actually gets triggered, whether it's the allstats Lambda function or the new team Lambda function. Okay, and I'll talk about like how do we actually trigger that post, how do we simulate that. So I know we can test it if we go to API Gateway, and I'll show you this because I've already built it out and what it should look like. But it has to be a post, and then this data has to be in the request body. So our team information has to be in the request body. That's what sends it to the event object. Okay, we're going to have to enable cores for the API. And then you have to deploy it. And I tell you to deploy it to a stage named Baseball Stats. So you're going to get some generated Amazon URL, and then the final piece of it will be /baseball stats. That's the stage name that you're going to use. Okay, and then all of this, so I kind of get into this with the project overview. Basically, you have a startup that has baseball data, and a customer came to you, approached you, and said, I'll pay you if you can provide your API for us and get our sample app working. Okay, as long as you're willing to get their working proof of concept based on their JavaScript front end. I give you a JavaScript front end that should access your API. That's this zip file right here. Okay, so that zip file is really this P2 sample application that I have on my desktop. I've already downloaded it and extracted it. It's an HTML file and a JavaScript file. And if I open this, so let me go ahead and open it in Atom. And I'll blow up the font so we can see. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to notice is that I have this URL hard-coded, so I have a global variable that's pointing at my API. So I've built out this API. I have a working copy of your project 2. So my URL is pointing at my API. You're going to have to change that URL to your API. Okay, that's the only thing you should change in this file is the URL. Everything else should be working. So if you're going to build out your API, like the expectation is that your API will then work against this client application. Okay, so if we look at the client application, so I'm just going to go ahead and open it in a browser. The way this works is I have a form that allows you to add new teams. Okay, and the team ID takes a format of team info underscore, so I preload that data into that text field. So if I want to add a new team, that's how I do it. The sort key, and then the team name. I show you an existing list of teams, and I also show you an existing list of players. And I'm ignoring the games. So remember, your all stats API is going to give us games, it's going to give us players, it's going to give us teams. You send all that information back to me. I filter it down to pick the records that I want. I picked all the teams and I picked all the players. I ignored the games. The sample app is just ignoring the games. I have that data available to me. I'm ignoring it. Okay, so from that data set, I build out these tables. Okay, in addition to that, I'm able to add new teams. So you'll notice on my instance, I have the Brewers. Let's say I wanted to add the Madison Mallards. Okay, so my Madison Mallards is going to be MML. And then the team name, Madison Mallards. And I add that team name. Why am I not seeing it? There we go. Eventually, the insert happens, and it gets populated down at the bottom of my list. Okay, so I have a new team. That's calling the new team API. I'm sending this data as a JSON object to my API via a post, and then my API is wiring that to my Lambda function to create a new team. The Lambda function takes that data and inserts it into DynamoDB. Okay, that's the connection that we have. My data is persistent, so if I refresh this, you'll see that the Madison Mallards show up here. Notice the sort order is a little different. I don't have a solution for that. Like, I don't have their schema in terms of how they're inserting the records. I guess I could sort the records as they come back, maybe. But I didn't. But the point is the data is persistent. I can't add new players. I can't add new games. I can't see games. Like, this is the client application that should run against your API when you're done. Okay. So if we dig into the JavaScript code just a little bit, again, the only thing that you're going to change is the API URL. All right, because it's going to be your API. So you're building out your own version of the API gateway that's connected to your own Lambda functions, that's connected to your own instance of DynamoDB. Okay, so the only thing you're changing is the URL. Okay, so you'll notice what ends up happening is this button is wired to a click event, which will trigger the add new team. So let's look at that first. So if I go back over to the browser, there's a button. There's an event handler for this button. So when I click it, something happens. That's set up right here. It's going to trigger this function named add new team. So here's the function. I determine the parameters that I want to send. I want to send a team ID, a sort key, and a team name. I'm just grabbing those values from the form. Then I use the fetch API saying I'm going to use the API URL. That's that global variable for my API. I say go to that URL, go to that API via an HTTP post. The request body is going to have my params. It's going to have my new team. So that's what I'm sending it via the body. And then I'm saying that my request content type is application/JSON. And then I send the request. So by me sending this data, that triggers the process of I hit the API is wired to Lambda, Lambda's connected to DynamoDB. I have that chain of functionality built out within my API. I don't do much for verification. Again, this is kind of quick and easy. I just wanted to make sure that it was up and running, proof of concept. I get a response. The response is really just an empty object if it was successful, which is not a real confirmation. Okay, so I could do more there, but I didn't. You don't have to. So I convert it to JSON, I log that empty object, I add the new record to the teams table if it's successful. If it wasn't successful, I just log the error to the console. Okay, so if yours is not working, so if your API is not working or something's set up incorrectly on your end, what you'll see is a console message saying, hey, something failed. You'll get the error message about why it failed. This is really your test. Like when you demo this to me, this is really what I want to see is, does your client application actually work? Okay, and obviously I'll look at the individual points like the API gateway points and the Lambda functions and the DynamoDB database table. But really it's pretty easy to see from this client application if all the pieces are working. Okay, so that's the add. The initial load of these tables, so the teams and the players, that comes from this fetch where I say go fetch the baseball stats. You'll notice I don't have a method type. I don't say that it's via an HTTP post. I don't have a body parameter. And the reason why is the default is an HTTP GET, and the GET does not have a body. So I'm going to do an HTTP GET request to my API, which is going to then give me all of the stats information back. So I get all that data, I convert it to JSON, because it comes back as a string, I convert it to JSON, and then baseball stats is that JSON object. And here's where I filter it down to say, give me the teams and output those teams. Give me the players and output those players. Okay, this is that function. And again, if your API is not working, so for some reason you're not sending back the data, all I'm doing is logging the error message. So in your console, you'll see an error message. Okay. There's nothing you have to do to run the client application in regards to getting the HTML to run and the JavaScript to run. You can see that I'm just running it off of my file system. So I just have those files on my desktop. This is the HTML file. The JavaScript file is right next to it in that same folder. So I don't have to host it through a web server. If you want to, you could post this out to S3 and run it. So if you post this on S3 and you go to an interview and a company says, hey, what'd you do in the Cloud for Developers class? This is an awesome example. Right? Hey, I built this JavaScript client application. Maybe you didn't build it, but you're hosting it on S3 and you're running the client application that's hitting an API gateway API via get or post, and then it's wired to your Lambda function, which then stores your data and persists data in DynamoDB. It's pretty cool to talk about, right? And it's easy. Like you just take the client application, put it on S3, make it a statically hosted website. Okay. If you download the client application right now, you'll hit My API, it should be working. So you can test the client application right now. One thing I will talk about, because I didn't realize it, so I was getting frustrated because I know that I'm building out another API for the advanced JavaScript class, and that class is basically by student, like a task list. Okay, so given a student ID, what's your task list? And one of the things that was really bugging me was when I get all of my tasks, I'll show you the API. When I get all the tasks, it would also have the data type associated with the task, like indicating that the task was a description. Sorry, I'm in the API. I want to be in Lambda. Okay, so if I ask for all the tasks and I test this, what'll happen is I'll get tasks for my student ID. There's not very many. There's probably 5. I don't know if I deleted the tasks or what. That's annoying. Oh, I know why. Because my all tasks accepts a student ID parameter that I don't have hard coded. So here are the tasks that I have. This is how I want my data to look. So I have a collection of items. You can see whether the task is complete, a student ID, a description, and then the data on the right-hand side of the equal sign. If I use the all tasks method, I'm going to head over to API Gateway. And I hit this with my student ID. I have an API key too. I think I can do it. I didn't mean to close that tab. I think I can show you from Lambda. I'm just hard coding my student ID, my employee ID. Okay, so when I run this, eventually it's going to succeed. And I want you to compare and contrast the data that I get back. So here I get back my collection of items. It's the same collection of items that I had before. But now each item and each attribute has a corresponding data type attached to it. So whether it's completed is a Boolean, the student ID is a string, the description's a string, that makes it a real pain for me to work with on the other side of this. Like I don't want to say go to the items and then dot completed dot bool. And I don't want to say items at index 1 dot description dot s. That doesn't make a ton of sense to actually have a data type indicator in your JSON. So then I was looking at API Gateway to how do I change the output format. So like we talked about on Tuesday, like how do I pull that data type off of my output, because it's a real pain when I'm working with DynamoDB. And the reality is I don't have to pull it off. So what I was doing wrong, and this is just because I was using a dated version of the code, is when I create this database client, I create it as a new AWS DynamoDB here. There's actually a new class definition called a doc client. So DynamoDB doc client. So it's a new class definition that AWS put out. So if I go back to my all functions alternate, it's the exact same code, except you'll notice that I'm using this document client instead. So same exact method, I query or scan. Doesn't necessarily matter. And then when I test it, now you'll notice the output pulls off that data type. So my suggestion for you is you do not want to deal with those data types on your inserts. And I wrote the project description that way. So for instance, when I insert a new team record, you'll notice that there's not a data type associated with the team ID or the sort key or the team name. It's just the corresponding value. Then for your API, for the code, you have to be using that doc client library for AWS. Does that make sense? So the way I would start the project if I was you is I'd say, hey, I need to, and maybe you have the database. So I'm kind of skipping over that part where you have the Dynamo table that's already there. I need to create a Lambda function. That's the first thing I need to do, and probably the all stats Lambda function is the correct starting point. So what'll end up happening is, if you're like me, I'm going to jump over to the course content and say, hey, do we have code for that? Here's the node CRUD source code. Create, read, update, delete. So I go ahead and download that and extract it. And I'm going to add that project to Atom. And I want to see the index page. So we're hitting baseball stats local. And it looks like we're just doing a scan. So instead of asking for a DynamoDB object, what we really want is a DynamoDB.document client. And I'd want that for the select, for the delete, for the create, and when I do that, you can see how I had coded it to have the data type here. It's going to be wrong. So I really don't want the data type here anymore. Okay, so what I'm telling you is you kind of have bits and pieces of everything that you need for the project. There's nothing that you can just pull and say, oh yeah, this will work for me. Which is okay. Like, that's probably the reality of your life. Right? When you go get a job, you'll have bits and pieces that work here and there, and then you got to pull those puzzle pieces together and fix what's broken. Okay, that's kind of how the project is set up. Okay, but with regards to the project, when you're creating the client application, the only thing that you should end up modifying is that URL. So I have a global variable. Again, I wouldn't normally have a global variable, but it was easy just to put at the top of the script so you could see it. That's the only thing that you should change. That should point at your AWS API gateway URL, that endpoint that you deploy. Okay. My guess is that this is a longer project. So I built it out last night in about 2.5 hours. And like, if I'm writing the advanced JavaScript projects, it takes me about 15 minutes. Right? So like, some of you are in the advanced JavaScript class, and you know like how long those projects take. So when you start to dig into them, like, there's some detail and some stuff that you have to work on, and it takes a little longer. I'm pretty comfortable in both, but it's just there's more steps to AWS. This project's bigger. Okay? But I also think that end result is better. Right? Like, I can host this on an S3 bucket and go into the career fair and say, hey, here's a site that I built using AWS services. And it's all AWS services. It's all serverless. I don't own any of it. It's all in JavaScript. Okay? So that is project 2. I mentioned this in my advanced JavaScript class, or maybe I mentioned it in here. Like, development's a painful process, right? I just had it with my daughter. Like, I had this conversation with my 15-year-old daughter. So she's taking calculus right now, and she's trying to basically differentiate sine, cosine, tangent, arctangent. And she's like in tears. She's like, I got an exam tomorrow. I don't know how to do this. And I'm like, you have an exam, and like this is when you're breaking down? You're probably pretty close, but now you're breaking down. If you would have started this a week ago and studied a week ago, you could have broke down a week ago and it wouldn't have been a problem. You could have gone to your teacher and said, look, this is where I'm stuck. This is where I'm running into the problem. You could have got the solution. You could have got targeted feedback. Like, I'm stuck on this particular problem. But now, because it's the day before the exam, like, you think it's a disaster and it's the end of the world. Everyone gets stuck. So get stuck when it's not going to be painful. Get stuck a week before the assignment's due so that you can get feedback like, hey, I'm stuck here. I don't know what's going on. Like, what is my next step? How do I debug this? I can't go any further. Like, you're probably pretty close when you get to that point of frustration, like where you need targeted feedback. Like, you're stuck. I can give you targeted feedback, and in 10 minutes, you're going again. Right? And I'm sure my daughter was the same way. But again, we're all like, I'm going to put it off to the last minute. I'm going to procrastinate, and now it's going to be painful, and now I'm stuck like in this painful process of I just got to power through it, even though it would have been easier if I was able to have a conversation with an expert or someone that knows the answer. Right? So that's my feedback for you. You can procrastinate all you want, but my guess is you're going to get stuck at some point along the way, which is totally normal. Everyone does. And if you don't, consider yourself lucky. Right? That's part of the development process. You're going to get stuck. So